Hi everyone, it is really wonderful to be able to speak with you, our members and supporters, via this web series. I hope you're all safe, I hope you're all well. These are crazy times and I'm sure we're all going just a little nuts. But one of the nice things to come out of this situation is the ability for us as curators to be able to engage directly with our members and supporters through this video series. My name is Dr. Jamie Fraser. I'm the curator for Anatolia and the Levant in the Middle East Department at the British Museum. The Levant being that part of the Eastern Mediterranean that borders with the Middle East, so Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, Israel, Palestine, and Anatolia being Turkey. And today I thought I would chat just a little bit about one of the exciting projects we're doing in the Middle East Department about the archaeology of olive oil. Now, I'm sure you've heard of the very famous Mediterranean diet, this diet predicated on the holy triumvirate of grain, grape, and olive, so bread, wine, and oil. And this is not a fad diet like the keto diet or something that's emerged very, very recently on social media. This diet is absolutely integral to the fabric of how cultures have developed in this part of the Mediterranean for millennia. And one of the reasons why it's cited as being so healthy even today is that it delivers its main source of fat as plant-based fat, olive oil, rather than, say, a North European diet that delivers its main fat base as animal-derived fat, so dairy or through meat. And so what I'll do is quickly run through a bit of the history of how olives and cultures have developed over time, and then talk a bit about some excavations we're doing at what I think is an olive oil factory in Jordan that's over 4,500 years old. The first time that people really start to exploit or harvest olives probably dates to around the Neolithic period, so about 6,000 BC, give or take. And what they're doing is harvesting wild olives. Olives grow wild in that Mediterranean basin, particularly in the Levant and southern Anatolia. And so fast forward 1,000 years to about 5,000 BC, and we've got to a point where people have domesticated the olive tree and have started planting orchards and really farming it horticulturally, properly. By that 5,000 BC mark, this is the Copper Age, the Chalcolithic period, oil has transformed the way people are living their lives. It gives people a source of lighting in their lamps. You don't have to go to bed with the sun anymore. You can keep reading in the living room. It provides a means for preserving food for much longer, particularly dairy products. And of course, it changes the way people cook and the way and the breadth and depth of their cuisines. Now, fast forward again to about 3000 BC, and that's the period, particularly in the Levant, in the southern Levant, so Jordan, Israel, Palestine, where we see the fluorescence of the region's earliest cities. Or at least what I mean by that is the fluorescence of large central sites surrounded by monumental fortification walls in which a large number of people live, and you see the development of political offices such as kings or temples that control power structures. Now, the development of those cities in this part of the world is fundamentally based on the exploitation of olive oil, and in particular, the trade of olive oil with Egypt. Now, the Middle East has always been an oil economy. It just starts off being one of olive oil. And that's because olive only grows in particular areas, particularly upland, well-watered areas. It doesn't like floodplains because its very woody roots, rot. So think of, say, the Nile Delta of Egypt, which floods every year. Really bad idea to try an olive farm there. Don't do it. The hills of Jordan, the hills of Israel, Palestine, however, are perfect. And this is probably one of those kind of Goldilocks zones for olive exploitation, where olives are first domesticated from the outset. Anyway, around about the 4th millennium BC, sort of 3,500 to 3,000 or so, people in the southern Levant go, this olive oil commodity, others seem to like this. And the Egyptians go, that's great, we can use that in our embalming and a whole lot of sacred rites. In fact, we'll call it one of our 7 sacred oils. And a complicated trade network develops where oil is being sent down to Egypt, and Egypt is sending back probably flax, textiles, and cattle. Now, that's all well and good for the development of these earliest cities in the region. But something happens to that early urban experiment in the southern Levant, and all of those early cities collapse. The whole urban system disintegrates. Now, this isn't like the zombie apocalypse. This isn't, the coronavirus of the Bronze Age world. This happens very gradually over the course of several centuries. But, I think of it like I'm up in the International Space Station looking down at night, and gradually, one by one, the cities all switch off their lights until there's no cities left, and the population disperses into rural village communities. Now, you put 6 archaeologists in a room to work out the reasons why this collapse happens, and you're going to get 8 different opinions and about 17 broken legs. One of it is probably climate, one reason is probably political upheavals, but you have to understand, I think, the role of olive oil and the role of olive oil trade if you are to understand this collapse of the early urban experiment. And that comes down to the fact that the Egyptians, who are driving this demand for olive oil, increase their technologies of maritime shipping, and they can suddenly realize their ships can actually reach the northern Levant, so Syria and Lebanon, who are also developing olive oil surpluses for trade. And if they do that, they can hook back through the winds and the currents, hit Cyprus, trade also for copper and very precious metal, and come back to Egypt that way, which means they bypass the southern Levant completely. And that means that these early urban systems that developed, these early urban cities that developed partly based on this trade of olive oil, suddenly have the rug whipped out from underneath them because this main export commodity is no longer in demand, at least not from them. And that might be why these systems gradually collapse. Now, one of the issues we're looking at in this olive oil story is, well, what happens when that demand is removed? What happens to the olive oil industry when it's no longer driving an international export market, but is actually part of a local fabric? How does it get reconfigured? How does it get reimagined? And in order to answer that question, we've been excavating at a site called Khirbet al Ghazlan that is located in Jordan. Now, Khirbet al Ghazlan in Arabic means the ruins of the mother of the gazelles, which is lovely, I think. And it's located on a steep, very well defensible knoll or hilltop that overlooks a very steep-sided valley called a wadi, and that's named the Wadi Rayyan. It's about halfway up the wadi, so it's about 400 meters above sea level in areas that olive grow really well in. And, well, if you work there in the spring, and I've spent a few springs there, it is the most beautiful place on the planet. It's green, it's lush, and there are wild flowers everywhere. Lupins, poppies, honestly, it's like digging with Julie Andrews. It's great. The key thing about this site is that it's really, really small. It's only about 100 meters by about 50 meters. It's tiny. Most archaeologists, if they came across it as a survey, would go, this is a village or a hamlet or even a farmstead. But it's enclosed by a monumental circular circuit wall. And in fact, where you walk onto the site through a kind of a saddle connecting it to a ridgeline, that wall is built of massive boulders, 2 rows wide, that really stops access onto the Khirbet al Ghazlan knoll, the hilltop. And that doesn't kind of work with how we understand archaeological landscapes. Ultimately, the big driving question behind this project is, well, why on earth would you go to all that effort to defend such a titchy, scrappy little hilltop site in the middle of nowhere? It doesn't make sense. Well, I think what we're dealing with is an olive oil factory. So olive grows really well in these hill zones of Jordan, Israel, Palestine. And there are several of these enclosure sites from this period of urban collapse. It's called the Early Bronze Age 4 period. So we're talking about 2500 to 2000 BC. And all of them are located in upland, hilly areas, which are perfect, that Goldilocks zone for growing olive. And I wonder, when people harvest their olive, it's a huge concentrated kind of month-long effort where all the fruit that is ripe is being picked and pressed, the olive oil is extracted, and they have to store it in one central point as the harvest continues for about a month before they can then distribute the olive back to the local villages, the local settlement network, back to wherever it needs to go. That means for about a month, you've got like a bank vault in the landscape, a cache of one of the most precious commodities you can have in that Bronze Age world. And that needs to be defended. So why defend such a small site? Well, it's not because you're building city defenses. You're building kind of bank vault defenses. You're temporarily defending a cash crop commodity from predators, from bandits, from tribesmen, from whatever, before you can then distribute it out. So that's kind of the research question we were going into when we started excavating at Khirbet Ghozlan. Now, I got back from Jordan a few months ago, just before the apocalypse happened, and I was in Jordan in November, December to do some excavations at this site, but also because that autumn period of November, December, or particularly November, is when the modern olive harvest happens today in this area. And so we wanted to have a look at some of the processes that are involved in harvesting olives today, because that is, of course, the best analogy to interpreting what we were finding in the dirt at Khirbet Ghozlan if it was an olive factory as well. So some of the photos that you're about to see, or the videos you're about to see, were only taken at the end of last year from one of the olive mills that is currently working in Jordan at a village called Tubna. It's quite a traditional mill and was a really lovely place to see. So how do modern Jordanian farmers harvest and press their olives? Well, it's much the same, although it's sort of mechanized now. The steps are much the same as they always have been. And the first thing is, of course, is you have to harvest your fruit. And there's a wonderful image of this happening on the side of a Greek vase by a painter called the Antimenes painter that we have in the British Museum, where you see the farmers hitting the trees with their sticks in order to make the olives fall down, which are then gathered in the net. After that harvest, after the olives are down, people then need to gather them up and sort them out, because there's a lot of debris in that, twigs and leaves and caterpillars and all the other sorts of stuff that no one actually wants in their olive jar at the end of the day. The olives, once they've been sorted, sometimes then get washed. But to be honest, if you wash the olives, it's probably a bad idea, because introducing water to the process can lead to emulsification. And that means minute water droplets get mixed up with the oil, which lowers the quality. So traditionally, Jordanian farmers wait until the first winter rains to wash the summer dust off the fruit and then go, hello, now's the time to start harvesting. Those boxes or bags or sacks of olive fruit are then brought into the olive mill, and the first thing they're done is they're tipped through a big kind of conveyor and onto a large circular crushing basin. And a large stone millstone is ground around the olive fruit, crushing the fruit, crushing its seeds into a kind of fibrous tapenade-like paste. That paste then gets scooped up and smeared onto circular sort of nylon or traditionally hair or straw mats. Kind of like, imagine if you were trying to, put peanut butter on a pancake or something. And that happens on dozens and dozens of mats, then get stacked up one on top of the other. So you've got this stack of pancake-like mats, which contains all this paste, which then needs to get pressed. So in the modern olive mills, that can happen in a number of ways, but one of them is to apply huge pressure, like through a vise, pressing down those mats from the top and from the bottom, or traditionally also with a screw, sort of screwing it down, so the oil is extracted, seeps out from that paste, and then it drips down the side and into a collection tank. Well, I could tell you the Arabic word for those drips, the tears of angels, but frankly, I'd be lying. It is a beautiful sight. That oil is then collected, and depending on the purity, it might be ready to go, or very often, particularly for traditional methods, it's then kept in large tanks or large ceramic jars for maybe a month, because there's still a lot of impurities, there's still a lot of water in that kind of juice. And by leaving it to settle for a month or so, The oil by density rises to the top, so that you can then scoop the oil off, leaving the water and the other debris behind. So you have your pure extra virgin olive oil ready to go. So if we were trying to track that process in the archaeological record, one of the things we needed to think about is, well, what would that look like? What would we expect to see as the kind of residues of this process in an archaeological site that had been abandoned and covered up and forgotten about for millennia? Well, we would expect to see things like perhaps olive presses, particularly cut in bedrock, crushing stones, storage jars for liquids, maybe decanting vessels to decant the oil off, botanical remains, evidence for that crushed olive stone in the soil itself. A whole lot of different bits and bobs that may or may not help articulate the picture. And so when we turned up at Khirbet Gozlan, first in 2017 and again in 2019, we had the kind of picture of the sorts of things we were hoping to find. Now, we went in hoping to find kind of this much to do with olive oil. I was expecting to find maybe this much, but actually the site was remarkable, and the data it yields is just, it blew our minds, the amount of amazing olive-related data we were able to get from these excavations. It's really exciting. And one of the things that we found was that there's not a settlement up there. There's really just one or probably two large compounds. And these compounds aren't houses. I think they're storehouses. I think these are the compounds where people are placing their olives and their olive jars full of oil. And one of the reasons why we think that is because they're not really made up of large domestic rooms like kitchens or bedrooms. They're made up of small, very discrete 1 by 1 meter, half meter by half meter storage units, storage bins that you can't walk in and out of, but you can leave things in like oil jars. Also, there are several kind of larger courtyard areas that have work surfaces, so floors laid down. And embedded within those floors are large crushing stone. So imagine getting a sort of a small boulder of limestone and grinding up the top till you've got a really smooth kind of cup hole in that you can put things like olive fruit and crush it to make that paste that you need. And these had been deliberately embedded within the floor so people could sit over them, put in perhaps their olive fruit, and use those areas to prepare the olive paste. And along the wall lines of all these activity areas, and this was really quite astonishing, were lined up concentrations of storage jars. Now, these weren't complete storage jars, all pristine as they'd been left. They'd been broken and forgotten about. But they're all complete because they mend up back together. And that's what our conservator is doing on these jars right now. And that's fantastic because one of the really interesting results from this excavation has been that the flavour of all the ceramics that people are using is overwhelmingly to do with storage. Now, if you dig a normal farming site or a normal settlement site, you would expect some storage jars, but cooking pots and serving vessels and drinking cups and large platters to serve up food for the family. We were getting hardly any of those other sorts of shapes. Almost all of our ceramics from this site are to do with storage. And some of them actually were large storage jars. So imagine a sort of bulbous jar coming up with a high shoulder, and from the top of that shoulder would stick out a large cylindrical spout. Now, if you imagine filling up a pot like that with, say, wine, you can't pick it up and then pour it so the wine comes out the spout. It's too heavy, it doesn't make sense. But if you fill it with oil and then you leave it for a month, the oil inside is settled out to the top. So you can then perhaps pour in some water, forcing the oil to come out the top through that spout and decant off. I think these are our decanting vats. We also found several types of a very particular stone tool called a Canaanian blade. Now, these are long, narrow, linear pieces of flint knife blades, basically. Stick your hand up straight in the air, and that distance from the base of your palm to the top of your middle finger, that's usually the sort of size that they are. Now, it's very rare to find these complete. Normally you find them broken up quite deliberately into segments so they can be hafted into kind of curved bits of wood or bone and used as scythes for agricultural cereal farming. Not these ones, they're complete, and several of them had kind of half crescent notches at one end where they've been hafted or tied and used as a very different sort of tool. Now they're all denticulated like a knife, like a knife from your kitchen, along both of the edges. And I wonder if these are our olive pruning saws used to prune the olive orchards as you do the harvesting, just as people do today. And that's a fascinating thought. It's only a possibility, but we're working on it, because the archaeobotanical data we've got really does sing. Now, what I mean by the archaeobotanical is the traces and the remains of actual plant species. These are all very, very, very small. One of the things we were doing when we were excavating was whenever we found charcoal in the soil, we would carefully cover it in alfoil, put it in a sample bag, write where it came from and its context numbers, and eventually they were all sent to the research laboratories at the British Museum, where the amazing Dr. Caroline Cartwright, senior research scientist at the British Museum, looked at those bits of charcoal under her scanning electron microscope, which zooms in at uber high levels, and she can look at the sort of cellular structure of the wood, and she can identify the species. And this tells us the sort of wood that people were burning at the site. Now, I would expect on a normal farming village to be a whole range of different wood, wild and domestic, that people pick up and burn from whatever they have to hand. When Carolyn told me the results, she said, "This is quite extraordinary. Every single one of those samples is olive wood. I've never seen anything like it, every single one." And to me, that suggests that people have a ready supply of olive wood that you would associate with pruning their olive orchards if they're up there for harvesting. But it's not only just branches of the olive trees. Carolyn was able to identify the small kind of saplings or shoots or suckers that come off the trees, which people prune if they're maintaining their orchards. But that's not the sort of wood you would normally select to burn in your fires when you're making a cup of tea. It's too green, it's too young, it's too scrappy. But it's there in this case because it gets mixed up with those orchard prunings that then get dried and burned on the site. But the smoking gun in all of this was the jift. Now, the jift is that crushed olive seed you get from that paste. Now, one of the really fascinating things about the olive extraction process is that paste that gets laid onto those mats. After the oil's extracted, that paste is punched out and it's not thrown away. It's usually scooped up, and we actually saw some guys at one of these factories shoveling it into sacks. And we asked them, "Well, why are you doing this?" And they went, "Well, this is great fuel for the fire. And also sometimes we like to put it back on our olive trees because it's awesome fertilizer, and hey, it's free." So that crushed olive stone jift, you would imagine to come across it in the archaeological record, particularly if it's been burned because it's been charred and then it preserves. And Caroline was able to detect traces of jift in all the organic samples that we collected and sent to her as well. The smoking gun that olive pressing was happening. The other really fascinating result was that all along the ridgeline behind Khirbet Ghozlan are scattered several olive presses. These are cut into bedrock. Now, these aren't the large presses that we see from the Tubner olive mill. What we're talking about is kind of a basin hewn into the limestone bedrock, maybe kind of a metre by 70 centimetres or so, big rectangular vat into which you put your fruit and then apply maybe some matting and then put pressure on the top. And then at the bottom end of the vat, we always see a kind of circular channel carved out of the base. And that's where the olive oil and juice could flow, and it collects in a much smaller, rounder vat down the bottom, which is the juice collection tank, or very probably where ceramic store jars were nestled, so the oil flowed directly into the jar. We can't date these. These are features in the landscape that could have been made any time, but they are so close to Khirbet Ghozlan spatially and visually that I suspect that that's when they were being used. So we've got really good evidence for ancient oil production at the site. How would people use the site then? How would it work? Well, I think one of the lenses into understanding this comes through from a very famous inscribed stela that was found at a place called Gezer in Israel, Palestine. It dates to the 10th century BC, so quite a bit after Khirbet Ghozlan, but in the kind of Paleo-Phoenician, Paleo-Hebrew script. What it sets out is a seasonal calendar for what farmers have to be doing at different times of the year. And you know what? In October, November, it says, now is the time you need to harvest and press your olive fruit. And it also says, July, August, now is the time you need to prune your olive trees. So I don't think people are like that Geza calendar living at this site. They're coming there seasonally to prune their trees, maybe leave the wood to dry, and they come back later in October, November and press the fruit and make the oil. And that 10th century example from Geza is a great analogy, but an even better analogy are the olive oil factories that exist in Jordan today, because that is exactly how the modern olive oil factories work. And I'll show you some pictures here of an olive oil factory we visited, which was only a couple of kilometers from Khirbet Ghozlan itself in Jordan. When we visit these factories in the off season, so before the harvest time, they're dark, they're gloomy, all the equipment is under tarpaulins inside. It's kind of like walking through a school during the school holidays. It has no soul. But come the harvest time in October, November, the Jordanian government declared this year that 15th of October was the start of the harvest. The door is unlocked, the lights are turned on, the equipment is unwrapped, and these become some of the most dynamic places in Jordan as all the farmers are bringing their olives in to get crushed and extracted into oil. And there's movement and there's light and there's dancing and singing and the radio's blaring and people are puffing on cigarettes and catching up on the local village gossip. And it's a really amazing dynamic place to be. And I think that is exactly how Khirbet Ghozlan was happening, or was functioning as an olive oil factory 4,500 years ago. Exactly the same, just separated by a little bit of time. Now, why do we all care about this? Well, we care about this very much. We care about it because it helps us better understand how urban societies developed and fell and then redeveloped in the southern Levant, particularly in the late prehistoric periods. Now, at the same time that Khirbet Ghozlan has been visited and pressed, so about 4,500 years ago, perhaps the largest city in the world was a city called which was on the South Mesopotamian floodplains of southern Iraq. This is 100 hectares in size. It probably supports a population of anywhere between 50 and 70,000 people. And we know how those cities develop and function really, really well. It's all about agricultural sort of cereal surpluses being brought in and then held by priests and by kings and then redistributed and traded for elite goods and all that sort of stuff. And that model works really well for Mesopotamia, but it doesn't apply to the southern Levant. The problem is our sort of traditional historical narratives and understanding of urban development derive from Mesopotamia. So we've got to think about them differently at the Levant. And if we look at sites such as Khirbet Ghozlan and the sites around it and those early cities that collapse, they don't look like the Mesopotamian examples. They're much, much, much smaller. Does that mean that urban systems are null, that it never happens in this area? Or does it mean that they just happen differently? And Khirbet Ghozlan is saying, yeah, actually, you've got to think of urban systems not just discrete to these sort of smaller central city sites, but the entire rural hinterland kind of connects up this system like sinews in a larger body. And people are using seasonally different micro-environmental niches at different times of the year that complement the whole urban system. And if you look at it as a much broader kind of package, suddenly you're approaching the scale of Mesopotamian urbanism. It just looks a bit different. Also, that story of oil is fundamental to that urban story in the southern Levant. By looking at it at Ghozlan in this period of urban collapse, we can see, although urban systems collapsed and fell, there are some rural industries that prove so resilient that they kind of stitch together the absolute essential building blocks of society in this part of the world. And it's really important we understand how they work, because when urban systems rebound and recover, which they did in the early 2nd millennium BC, and I'm talking here what the biblical accounts would call the Canaanite civilization, it's probably those rural networks, those olive oil industries, that are the springboard through which these other urban societies then recover and blossom. But ultimately, why I like this site is because traditionally we've gone in and we've dug the big sites, the sexy sites, the big temples and the palaces, not scrappy little tiny sites like Gozlan in the middle of nowhere. Well, size doesn't matter. This might be a tiny, tiny site, and some of its most compelling data is microscopic. But even though it's so small, it has a huge voice to say about some of the big stories like urbanism and how we approach them. And so we've got to look at the whole our whole archaeological landscape kind of holistically in order to really get a better understanding of how these ancient societies worked. But I'll leave you with one quote. It's my favorite quote of any archaeologist of all time, because it really says why I go out and I do this digging at Khirbet Gozlan and other places like that. The research is really interesting. I think the questions we're looking at are really important. But ultimately, we're really having a lot of fun. And a South African archaeologist called Carmel Schreer was once asked, why did she start archaeology? And she said, well, I became an archaeologist so that I could drive around in a big Land Rover, smoking, cursing, and finding treasure. And she's kind of right. And although our treasure is, bits of olive fragments from 4,000 years ago, not the gold, silver, frankincense, and myrrh that you would expect, and why no one really smokes anymore, although there is quite a lot of cursing that still goes on, we do drive around in a big Land Rover and we have so much fun. Kent Flannery, another archaeologist, was asked why he did archaeology, and he said, well, that's easy. Archaeology is simply the most fun you can have with your pants on. And I think he's absolutely right. So that's really one of the projects that we're working on in the Middle East Department at the British Museum. It's been fantastic to share with you why that project makes me excited. Once the whole apocalypse is over and you can come back into the museum, please come and visit us in the Levant and the Anatolian galleries. And if you see me there with my face pressed up against a case, come and say hello, because I love talking about the collections in the British Museum. They are extraordinary, and there are so many stories to tell that I would love to share these with you sometime in the future. Stay safe, stay well. Hopefully I'll see you in the museum at some point.